Thanks, Pete, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming, and special thanks to the College of Charleston and the Bastia Society for this opportunity. Now, you all know that the Middle East is a very troubled place these days. Autocratic governance is the norm, and minorities of all sorts, ethnic, religious, ideological, face discrimination and persecution. The media are saturated with images of brutality committed by groups that draw their troops largely from locals who themselves have been subject to persecution. What I want to do today is to get behind these deadlines and address some very deep historical causes of the Middle East failures and of the current impasses, political impasses of the Middle East, some of the political conflicts of the Middle East, in ways that do not get discussed by academics, let alone the press. The Islamic State, otherwise known as ISIS or ISIL, burst on the global scene just a few months ago, but comparative political scientists have long seen the Middle East as a politically troubled, politically unsuccessful region. In global political indices, of which we have quite a few, I have 3 of them shown on the slide here, the Middle East stands out as a poor performer. Take the Clean Government Index that goes from 0 to 10. That's been prepared for the last 15 years or so by Transparency International. Look at the comparison between the Middle East and OECD. OECD is the club of industrialized countries. Turkey's a member of it, but I've taken Turkey out for these purposes and included in the Middle East for reasons that you will see. You can see that government is much less clean in the Middle East than it is in the OECD, which is another way of saying corruption is much more rampant. This is the World Bank's Rule of Law Index. We see again that the Middle East performs much less well than the OECD. And this is an index of civil liberties. This tells us that the Middle East is much less free, or the peoples of the Middle East are much less free than those of the OECD. This is an index that is prepared by Freedom House. Why is the Middle East so troubled politically? A common argument puts the blame on colonialism, essentially France and Britain, which colonized much of the region beginning in the 19th century. The French and the British weren't angels. They made mistakes, but they also set up some useful institutions. They also colonized most of the rest of the world, including places that have had a much better political record than the Middle East, that show up in the indices that I showed you and other indices with a much better record. So this cannot be, colonialism might be a factor, probably is a factor some degree, but it can't be the main factor. The relevant literature also points to post-colonial monarchs and presidents who have been supported by foreign powers, and with this support have favored, have pursued undemocratic and very repressive policies. This too rings true, but it invites the question of why this repression has persisted for generations on end. And when repressive regimes have fallen, democracy hasn't followed, and in fact, autocracy has been restored quite quickly. A leading example is Egypt. the Egyptian people for many years resented the rule of Mubarak and the inefficiencies that Mubarak's regime were causing. They finally rose up to topple Mubarak. Mubarak fell, but democracy did not follow. Another autocracy, one perhaps even harsher, has replaced it. Well, other observers hold the dominant religion of the Middle East responsible. Islam, they say, is responsible for the authoritarianism of Middle Eastern regimes. Of course, this claim has many variants. They all raise the question, again, of why this condition has persisted. Go back far enough in time, and democracy existed nowhere. In some regions of the world, rule of law strengthened, governance became more transparent, freedoms expanded, democracy took root, and according to all these indices, they started doing better relative to the past. Why is democratization proving so difficult to achieve in the Middle East? And insofar as Islam is a factor, where exactly does the problem lie? After all, religions can change. Islam is 14 centuries old, and it has been reinterpreted repeatedly in some domains, and reinterpreted quite radically. Why then in this particular area, or in these particular areas, religious freedoms, government corruption, why are the necessary changes proving so challenging? The suggestion that Islam is a factor is often brushed off on other grounds as well. Historically, Islam has been associated at certain times in certain places with social and political repression, but Islam has also been associated with shallow governance and small states, states that leave most economic activity to private actors. And in the Middle Ages, Islamic philosophy grappled with reducing arbitrariness in governance. On such grounds, some writers say, in fact, some quite distinguished writers, if rule of law is weak in the Middle East, this is not because of Islam, but in spite of Islam. We should look elsewhere. There are further reasons to be skeptical. Iran is ruled by ayatollahs repressively today, but its political performance wasn't much better under the repressive secular monarchy that preceded it, the Pahlavi monarchies. People in Iran were by and large not freer under the secular monarchy than they are now. And in the Arab world, countries ruled over the past 40 years by more or less secular dictators, Mubarak in Egypt, Saddam in Iraq, Assad in Syria. They haven't had better political records. In Turkey, since political power passed from secular parties to the Islamist AK party around 2002, basic political indices have improved, although in the past couple of years they have started to worsen. But they are still higher than they were when AK party came to power. Nevertheless, there are some basic reasons to explore the link between Islam and political underdevelopment. For one thing, Islam gave the region a common economic legacy through Islamic laws that were enforced very widely all across the region, and in fact beyond, also in the Balkans and some other places, until quite recently. And these laws contributed to holding the region back economically. Well, the region's traditional economic institutions that held the region back economically may also have affected its political trajectory, and that's worth exploring. Within the broader Islamic world, political performance is especially bad in this area, forget about Spain for the moment, because Spain, even though it falls in this category, it was reconquered by Christian Europeans. So look at the rest of this area. This is what is known in the academic literature these days as the Arab conquest area. These are places Islam emerged in this part of Arabia and Western Arabia, and these are in waves. These areas you see marked in shades of purple were added to the Arab Islamic state over a couple of centuries. Now, it turns out that this area, in this area, these indices I was showing you are particularly bad. If you remove this area, particularly this area, the darker purple areas, you take it out and look at the rest of the Islamic world, the Islamic world doesn't look so bad. The Islamic world is, in fact, basically average in terms of the indices I showed you: rule of law, civil liberties, cleanliness of government. So what this suggests is that institutions that played a particularly important role early on in this Arab conquest area may hold the key to what went wrong politically. And the key economic institutions of this area early on during the first couple of centuries of Islam, the 7th century AD and 8th century, these may have had major political consequences. Take a note at this. Notice that Turkey is basically not in this area, and now let me draw your attention to differences within the Middle East. I've included Turkey here because I'm going to talk a great deal about Islamic law, and until the end of the 19th century, Islamic law was the law of the land in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey's predecessor. But Turkey was outside the Arab conquest area, and it has persistently done better than the rest of the Arab conquest area. Iran was conquered early on by the Arabs. So this is again consistent with this finding. Turkey stands somewhere in between the OECD gold standard and the Middle Eastern record. So I'm going to be suggesting that Islam's economic legacy largely accounts for the current political instability and the political dysfunctions of the region. Let me point out that in advance that if the argument that I'm going to lay out is correct, Islam's economic legacy would constrain all governments today, not just those that are ruling in the name of Islam, not just the Islamist ones. Political performance would be limited if the mechanisms that I'm going to outline are correct. It would be limited regardless of the politics of the moment. It won't matter to overall performance whether power is in the hands, happens to be in the hands now of secularists or Islamists, for example. Of course, the identity of the oppressors and the identity of the victims will change. That will depend on who's in charge. In Iran, the Ayatollah repressed secularists. Before the Ayatollahs came to power, it was the Ayatollahs themselves who were repressed. In Tunisia, Ben Ali, the dictator who was toppled, repressed Islamists. The Islamic State is trying to annihilate Shiites and Christians, and so on. Okay. Now, until the modern era, the law of the land, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the Middle East was Islamic law, known widely as the Sharia. The Sharia incorporated several economic institutions that matter here, that had important political consequences. There's a taxation system known as zakat. Islam has a distinct form of trust that was used very widely to provide social services, and the organizations through which merchants and financiers pooled resources to conduct commerce and to produce goods for sale were also based on Islamic law. So let's start with the taxation. Islam emerged in Arabia in the 7th century. Its holy book is the Quran. The Quran instituted a system of predictable taxation to finance 8 specified categories of expenditure through the Islamic State. And this tax system was called zakat. According to this system, the poor do not pay taxes. They only receive services. The wealthy pay a tax, a progressive tax, at rates that are tied to their income and wealth. The rates were low compared to the typical rates of antiquity. And the fact that the rates were low and the fact that they were predictable, and they were predictable because they were actually based on numbers provided in the Quran, this is one of the factors why Islam spread so rapidly. Taxes were quite high in antiquity, and a religion that promised low taxes through its holy book was quite attractive to tribes accustomed to paying high taxes. So the Quran lists rates on gold and camel herds and other forms of wealth known in Arabia, where the religion emerged. These rates were meant to be fixed. In mandating the well-off to make fixed annual contributions to governance, the zakat system also capped annual contributions, annual payments to the state. So the zakat might have provided the foundation of a social contract involving equity and taxation. The wealthy pay more taxes than the poor, and at the extreme, the very poor don't pay at all. Some redistribution from the wealthy to the poor, but also predictable taxation and limited government. You have 8 categories of expenditure, and you know every year what you're going to have to pay for the year, and since the rates are specified in the Holy Book, they're not supposed to be changed. Well, this happy outcome did not occur, and let me say why. The reason has to do with Islam's very rapid transformation from an Arabian religion to a global religion. Outside of Arabia, the economic base differed from that of Arabia. You had agricultural societies, and Arabia, where it emerged, was basically, you had herding societies, very limited agriculture. Partly as a result, the constraints imposed by zakat lost relevance. Also, influential groups in captured territories demanded exemptions from one category of wealth or another. Rulers often made compromises and gave certain groups exemptions to build political alliances. And this contributed to the very rapid growth of the Islamic empire. Having curtailed the coverage of zakat, these influential groups that got the exemptions then began to treat as sacred the specifics of the restricted system rather than the principles of taxpayer equity, mild redistribution, predictable taxation, and limited government on which the original system was based. And in the process, they choked off influential people who had received all these all these exemptions choked off the capacity of the state to raise revenue through zakat. So states ruling in the name of Islam were forced to raise other taxes. So the upshot is that before long, taxation turned out to be whatever the state could get away with. This is not good for business. It does not make the wealthy happy if taxation is unpredictable, because they're the ones who have a lot of resources. They're the ones who have the resources that rulers are going to see when they need resources to fight a war or to do something else. They're not going to be happy. Now, when the wealthy lose one wealth shelter or one protector of one institution that protects their wealth, it is natural for them to look for another. That's how it is in the 21st century United States. That's how it is all over the world. Wealthy people who have wealth that can be taken away are always looking for ways to guard it, and as soon as governments plug up one hole, they look for another. Well, this is exactly what happened in 7th century Arabia. The wealthy who decimated the zakat system through loopholes were left without protection against arbitrary takings. They managed within a few decades to institute a new device to protect private assets. This new device was was a form of trust. The basic idea of the trust came from Roman law on the one hand and from Persian law on the other hand. The form of trust that was brought into Islamic law and that became part of the Sharia is called a waqf. A waqf, like any trust, has an endowment. Like any trust, it has a purpose. There's a service that it's supposed to provide. In an Islamic trust, in a waqf, the service has to be provided in perpetuity, which, as I'll point out in a little while, became a problem. So here's an example of a waqf-based service, a college in Baghdad that has a beautiful doors. This is from the top of one of the doors, one of the main entrances. It actually, what you see written here is actually the deed, part of the deed of the waqf, what its functions are. And one of the things it says is that, it gives the various assets that this waqf owns, the assets whose income will be used to provide this service, to keep this school running. What it also says here is that all these assets are sacred, and all assets that are providing income to this operation, to this school, are sacred. Now, that's one of the things that makes the waqf a wealth shelter. The waqf protected property rights through the common belief that waqf assets are sacred. Not only the structures that you see, here's another waqf. This was an inn for merchants that is in central Turkey. You have hundreds of these along the Silk Road. So not just the structure you see here, but also all of the assets, which would be farms and urban structures elsewhere that provided income, they would all be sacred. And this was very widely believed. This belief made rulers very reluctant to take over waqf properties. So when rulers, the Ottoman Empire, or before that, the Abbasid Empire, or others, when they needed resources in a hurry, when they were cash constrained, they took private property, but not property that had been converted into waqf. You can see that that's going to increase the incentives on the part of the wealthy to convert their resources into a waqf. Now, the other factor is that Waqf founders benefited personally from this shielding of wealth. It wasn't as though the founder who built this inn for merchants did it only for the sake of the merchants to promote trade. The law allowed him as the founder to manage the sheltered assets for a very good income, and also to designate the beneficiaries, and 99% of the time it was the family members and the descendants. So these waqfs remained, the control remained within families, and they could appoint all the employees. So a waqf like this would have lots of employees, and the employees were selected typically from family members and friends. So a lot of the resources returned to the founder, and they're quite safe. Okay, I should add that Waqf income is not taxed. So this is also, in addition to being a wealth shelter, it's a tax shelter as well. So as you can imagine, vast private resources will flowed into Waqf, serving many ends, mosques and religious schools, but also non-religious services like fountains. Here you see an example from Egypt, a Waqf formed in the 19th century. Soup kitchens, orphanages, hospitals, parks, you name it. The goal was largely to shelter assets from rulers. The share of real estate controlled by Waqfs grew over time. By the 19th century, depending on the location, between 15 and 50% of all arable land and all urban real estate was controlled by Waqfs. Okay, so it became economically massively important. The Waqf's emergence in the Middle East coincides with the emergence in Western Europe of the corporation, which is a self-governing organization. It's much more flexible than the Waqf. In the aftermath of the Western Roman Empire's collapse, rule of law was weak in Western Europe. Corporations emerged to provide law and order within narrow contexts. What matters here is that for a millennium, for essentially from the year around 800 to about 1800, the Waqf served as a vehicle for providing services that in Europe were provided primarily by corporations. So the early universities of Europe were established as corporations. Their counterparts in the Middle East, like Al-Azhar, which is still standing, it still serves as a college, as a seminary, was formed, is still run as a Waqf. In the West, urban services were provided primarily by urban governments, municipalities. In the Middle East, in the large cities of the Middle East, urban services were provided in a decentralized manner through Waqfs. Now, given that Waqfs came to control vast resources securely, they might have become powerful political players. They might have constrained the state by resisting actions harmful to their constituencies. And the resulting decentralization might have placed the Middle East on the road to democratization. In Western Europe, cities and guilds and universities organized as corporations served exactly that function. In constraining central governments, they became agents of democratization. However, for all their wealth, Waqfs remained politically powerless. They also limited participation in politics, and they inhibited the development of civil society. In short, the Waqfs failed to serve democratization the way corporations did in Europe. Let me elaborate and then wrap up. Now, first, by design, the Waqf was a rigid institution. Its caretaker was supposed to deliver services and manage assets according to the founder's instructions. In principle, the caretaker had to follow the deed even if conditions changed and the needs of beneficiaries changed. He needed to satisfy only one person, and that is the local judge responsible for monitoring the local waqfs. And for their part, the beneficiaries had no right to demand adaptations. The beneficiaries of a charitable complex like this, that had a hospital in it, that had a school, some other services, they had no right to demand adaptations. They had no right to say, medical technology has changed since 1207, let's provide medical services in a different way. This is not to say that medical services, the way they provided medical services didn't differ. They didn't change over time, but the way they had to change generated some of the pathologies we observe in the Middle East today. I'll come to that. So these norms here, that you basically, if you're a constituent, you have to receive services passively, they would have kept people from developing a sense that service providers ought to be accountable to them. Okay. Accountability of officials is absolutely central to democratization, and that's not something you're getting here. You do get it in Europe, where people expect the corporations to be accountable to the recipients of their services. If some beneficiaries somehow decide to pressure waqf officials to deliver a different service, there are different obstacles, there are additional obstacles that inhibit collective action. The caretaker has no disclosure requirements. The beneficiaries are not entitled to information on the budget, for example, or on the management. Beneficiaries have no discussion forum. There's no town hall, no annual meeting of users. And to make matters even more difficult for beneficiaries who want change, they do not participate in the caretaker's selection. They cannot replace an unresponsive, unsuccessful caretaker. You can do this in the case of a corporation. In the case of an urban corporation, a municipality, you can replace the mayor, okay? You can't replace the waqf caretaker. All varieties of democracy emphasize mass participation. The Islamic waqf is at odds with this feature of democracy. It discourages mass participation. And I'm referring here to orderly participation in politics through perpetual procedures, not to sporadic riots that occur when discontent boils over. There are lots of examples in Middle East history of riots that occur when food prices go up and people are upset, people are hungry, and they start rioting, and they topple the ruler, or they topple, they call for somebody's head, and they get it. The Arab Spring is the latest example. Many Egyptians were fed up. They demonstrated, and they got Mubarak removed. The important point about the Arab Spring is, the important point to recognize in this context, is that perpetual organizations were not behind it. When Mubarak was toppled and people went home, that was it. They were no longer organized. And the only organized force in the country outside of the state, the Muslim Brotherhood, picked up the pieces, and the only for people who didn't want the Muslim Brotherhood, the only alternative was to bring the army back, because they didn't have a civil society. The obstacles to orderly participation in politics had long-term consequences. People did not develop in this region the political skills that are absolutely critical to democratic governance. How to organize, how to communicate ideas, how to negotiate politically, how to treat compromise as a step toward achieving an end rather than a sign of defeat. Now this would have, if these things do not develop, it's going to be hard to build a democratic system in the future. Suppose now that in spite of the difficulties I've mentioned, a waqf caretaker and beneficiaries agree to lobby for some complementary service, let's say a road, okay? Let's suppose there are other waqf-supported services in the area. They'll all benefit from a better road, okay? The constituencies of these different waqfs will all achieve their goals more easily if they form a coalition. But a judge can block them if they form a coalition. They cannot form a coalition if the founder of the waqf didn't anticipate the need several hundred years possibly earlier and put it in the deed that they can form a coalition with another waqf. So there were no federations of waqfs in Middle Eastern history, no associations of educational waqfs. Every school was on its own in trying to solve its own problems. You had no regional waqf associations. Nothing that would correspond to the coalitions that formed in Europe among cities that, of course, filled various roles that waqfs did. If coalitions had formed in the Middle East, some of them may have gained permanence. They could have started a democratization process. Checks and balances would have emerged. Let's pull this together. The lack of politically effective private organizations limited opportunities to challenge absolutist rulers. Civil society stayed weak, so political checks and balances didn't emerge. And without checks and balances, you cannot have democracy, you cannot have democratization. No civil society, and you have autocratic rule. Autocrats don't yield power voluntarily. Autocrats, because they have a lot of power, they suppress whatever civil society emerges. They don't like private organizations that might constrain them. So you had a vicious circle that prevented democratization in the Middle East. If democracy arose in the West, this is not because kings and queens in the West were more benevolent and they decided to provide more freedoms to people, that they decided to constrain themselves. This didn't happen. They fought tooth and nail against restrictions imposed on them. It's because in the West you had epic struggles that were driven by groups that were organized, usually as a corporation, within universities, as cities, as religious orders, as unions eventually, as merchant associations. These types of groups demanded rights. They developed ideas for alternative orders. Their successes gave rise to rules and regulations and laws that were conducive to protecting the rights of organizations like themselves, and that were conducive to the establishment of new organizations outside the purview of the state. So there was a virtuous circle. As these organizations developed, they put constraints on the state, and as the state was constrained, it became easier to form these organizations that had political power. Let me end with the issue of corruption to add one more dimension to this. The figures on comparative political development, you'll remember in my second slide, pointed to high corruption in the Middle East. This is a pattern to which the waqf contributed. Changes in relative prices and technologies and other conditions created needs, of course, for reallocating the resources of waqfs. When adaptations could not be made, economic inefficiencies occurred. So caretakers looked for ways of circumventing the rules, and they found ways to reallocate resources, but these reallocations came quite often through acts of corruption. Judges were bribed, ambiguities in the wording of waqf deeds were exploited. And these acts contributed to a culture of corruption. Breaking the law became common and acceptable. Of course, we have law breaking in every society. There's jaywalking in, I'm sure, in Columbia, or Charleston, South Carolina, and other places. There are other forms of law breaking, but in the Middle East, law breaking and circumvention of the law, corruption has occurred traditionally in a much wider set of contexts. Okay, where laws are commonly evaded, it is hard to get people to obey new laws, and making people obey new laws is critical to modernization. I'll Simply, since I'm running out of time, I will just very quickly say that in the mid-19th century, it became possible to form corporations under new local laws, and the functions of waqfs in the Middle East were taken over by corporations largely. But even though it is possible in the Middle East to form European style corporations, or what in the United States we call charitable corporations, the political checks and balances still remain limited in the region, and civil society remains weak. The reason is that states have been committed to reducing their powers, and because the Middle East entered the modern era with a very weak society that allowed states to basically push around private groups. The state has been successful in repressing private groups precisely because civil society was weak to begin with. Meanwhile, states are weak as well, and that is because of the widespread corruption. The state has great difficulty controlling its own employees. There's widespread corruption and nepotism, and this makes it difficult to, when you do have good state programs, it makes it difficult to run them efficiently. What does all this mean for the region's political future? Well, there's some bad news, and the bad news is that there is no quick fix to the problems that I've identified in the Middle East. Military action can contain the worst manifestations, and we're seeing one of the worst manifestations now in Syria and Iraq, but this will not solve the root problems of the region. One problem I've identified is, or a key problem, is the lack of checks and balances to speed their development, to speed the emergence of checks and balances, and therefore to create the conditions for self-sustaining democracy. The outside world, of course, there are things that can be done. The outside world should be helping private groups insofar it's going to help the region. Throwing money at states and government agencies is going to not going to solve the problem, it's going to generally delay the solution. There is some good news, and I want to end with this. The basic ingredients of a strong civil society, or strong civil societies in Middle Eastern countries, are already in place. Many countries have laws for nonprofit corporations. Not only that, but nonprofit corporations are widely accepted, even though they did not exist in traditional Islamic law. They are widely accepted by populations, even in places with very conservative populations, as part of the traditional system. They're widely accepted as legitimate. Gradually, in countries where at least there is some political stability, they will gain strength and begin challenging the autocratic regimes. The process took many, many hundreds of years in the West. One shouldn't expect it to happen overnight just by writing a new constitution or changing the government in countries of the Middle East. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take some questions.